So, as I was saying, why would an unbelieving Jew write such things about Jesus? And if you recall, as I stated, the reasons given in the preface of Antiquities to begin with as to why Josephus was writing Antiquities to begin with. He was trying to endear the Jewish people to the population at Rome and to the Greek subjects that were under the power of Rome, you see. All the Gentile nations. He was trying to endear the Jewish people to them. He was saying that they asked him to write this book so that they could learn about the history of the Jewish people. And he would just all of a sudden now come along and say he was the Christ with no explanation as to what the Christ is. All through all of Josephus's writings, and particularly Antiquities, he never explains the concept of a Messiah to his readers. But see, this goes over our heads because being familiar with biblical material, or as a Christian being familiar with the tale, we wouldn't normally think that way. But that's why I constantly say it's important not to bring preconceived notions into a text we're reading, to try and figure out what did this mean to the people it was addressed to at the time that it was written. And Josephus, otherwise very thorough on so many subjects, you open up his book and you will see it's just a little tiny paragraph, and beneath it a paragraph this long about what happened to a woman at the Temple of Isis in Rome while Pilate was the prefect there in Judea. And I believe in that passage, I'll get to that eventually, but I think that there's something very important that we should know in that passage that kind of ties this thing with Jesus into that passage and is a key scripture that I've mentioned several times before, but I'll get to that in time. Also, along the same line, I'd like to look at another passage in Josephus, and this is in Antiquities, it's book 20, and the 9th chapter of Antiquities 20, and the very first paragraph. We're told of a high priest, Annas. And the younger Annas, who, as we said, received the high priesthood, was a bold disposition and exceptionally daring, and he followed the party of the Sadducees, who are severe in judgment above all the Jews, as we have already shown. And as therefore Annas was of such a disposition, he thought he had now a good opportunity. As Festus was dead, Albinus was still on the road. And so he assembled a council of judges and brought before it the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ, or in some versions it'll just say Jesus called the Christ, or the one called Christ, whose name was James, together with some others, and having accused them as lawbreakers, he delivered them over to be stoned. So this passage is basically telling us about something that Annas did, that he took upon himself more authority that he had in the absence of the governor, and took James, who in other places is called James the Just, and it's pointed out by Eusebius that he was always referred to as James the Just, but for some strange reason in this passage he's not called James the Just or James the son of Joseph. He's called James, the brother of the so-called Christ. And again, this passage would make you look back. The so-called Christ, or the one that was called the Christ? Well, we have in the previous books where we read about a Jesus that was the Christ. Who's this Jesus who was so-called the Christ? And again, realize, what's a Christ? What's a Messiah? So this kind of ties the idea together that Josephus never even conveyed the concept to his readers what the Messiah was, what this anointed one, the Christ, what was he supposed to be? What was he supposed to do? Josephus never tells anybody this. We, if we've had any kind of a Christian background, like I said in the last video, we know this, but nobody reading his book for the first time would have ever knew anything about this. And the thing that's very strange is that you start realizing that until Eusebius found that passage that we were looking at in book 18, until Eusebius found it, no one ever quoted it. Now, it's been argued that there was no need to quote it because nobody back then was questioning whether Jesus was ever really a human being or not, if he was ever actually here. But that's not true. Look into Josephus being quoted by Justin Martyr. He refers often to Josephus, so he was aware of the writings of Josephus, and Justin Martyr a number of times in his writings repeatedly keeps referring back to the prophecy, the text that's misused as a prophecy for Jesus' birth, when it was actually being used in Isaiah, was speaking of a sign to the king Ahab. And the Christians, how I've gone over this before studying Matthew, and how he took this right out of context and said that it was talking about Jesus. And Justin Martyr repeatedly talks to people about the virgin birth and how it was testified to by the prophets. Let me continue in the next video.